Quad 6.6. All right, I've got some preliminary data. So I've been using this little Beta FPV board with the built-in black box to go ahead and fly these frames around and grab some black box logs off of them. I did do it inside because I didn't want any wind affecting the logs. These things are so small that wind will definitely show up in the logs. That did present a challenge though. Doing my usual logging flights, which is usually a series of like punch outs, snap rolls, snap flips, and then twitch moves and other things like that. It's kind of challenging to do that inside. I don't have a giant space, I don't have very huge ceilings, and so I didn't capture a bunch of logs for each frame because I was worried of like smacking the motors around and props around and introducing noise as I went from one frame to the other. So I consider this data at this point in time a little bit preliminary, but I think we can get some sort of like thin down the herd a little bit. So the first thing to me that was kind of interesting was the big Chungo frame. So this is the Newb Drone Durable V2. It is the heaviest frame. It is the most solid feeling frame by far. It's also in it, and so comes in at around 5 grams, which is basically like 1.7 grams heavier than all the other frames. And it's got an interesting material. So if I tap it here, you can probably hear how it's sort of like, has like a high pitch, sort of like more plasticky sound to it than, for example, these other frames. Let's see how this is more of a rubbery sounding. It's more like, just has a different quality to it. So this frame is rigid, but I think a little bit to a fault because surprisingly enough, and this is on a dirty build, so these motors are pretty beat up. Props aren't clean at this point in time. So it is a little bit of a dirty build, but I wanted that because I wanted to push these frames and challenge them. But what was interesting about this is despite the rigidity, the logs, and I'm going to go through the logs after this initial little talking hands part, the logs on this frame were actually the worst out of all the frames, which was a little bit surprising to me. I think maybe if you've used this frame in the past, maybe it's not surprising to you. But it had the worst logs, and then also the weight was terrible. So with these little 0702s, these things feel great if the weight is low enough, but as soon as you start getting into the weight isn't quite low enough, it starts to feel awful. And this frame, basically it was loud and plasticky sounding and didn't perform well. And I just kind of couldn't wait to get the quad out of this frame. It was not my favorite frame. And so if you're looking at frames, unless like, and I can't see the durability of this justifying the weight or the performance it had in terms of the logs. I think what we're seeing here is that rigidity is important to prevent the resonance. So for example, like, this twisting and bending kind of resonance like that. But the material, rigidity, if it doesn't have a damping quality to it in these kind of generally flexible frames, I think it transmits certain frequencies or whatever into the board more than some of the other frames that have a little bit of damping sort of built in by having a more rubbery material. So maybe this frame works for some people, not for me, and I'm not going to look at it really anything beyond that. So then we get to frames that I found, I would consider these generally usable. The one I would say is probably the least usable to me was this old Happy model frame. The weight's fine, it's 3.3 grams. I have a 75 millimeter version of this frame and it's durable enough. And the logs were reasonable, but this battery holder is just oversized. So the battery is super loose, and I didn't bother when I was capturing the logs. The logs might even be better if you kind of like firm this up and put some padding in there to hold the battery better. But I didn't because I don't feel like dealing with that. And so just a loose battery holder, it's too loose to hold the stick style batteries in there for me. So that makes this frame just a no-go right off the bat, just based on the battery. And even though the performance might otherwise be okay, it's a no-go frame for me for these little whoops. The other thing to consider, and I think you could kind of feel this in the air, is that this arrangement with these little spars out on the ducts those little arms are thicker, and I think they block a little bit more thrust to the degree that you might notice a little bit. It didn't feel as underwhelming as the heavier frame, so this 1.7 gram penalty is more than what the ducts are doing, but I think the ducts, you could actually probably feel that. So that really narrows it down to 2 frames. I don't have the Beta FPV airframe. I think I will get one eventually for science, but those things are so floppy. I think you have to turn down the PIDs, and they just don't hold up. That's why I didn't get one off the bat. People are kind of asking about that frame. But I think it really comes down to these 2 frames as being the contenders. We'll see what We Bleed FPV does. But basically, I think as far as the logs go, I do think the Meteor 65 log is a little bit cleaner, but not so much so that the Newb Drone is not viable. I don't think you'd really have to really change your filtering or PIDs necessarily with the Newb Drone frame, at least from what I'm seeing. It's going to be a little dirtier. You're going to give up a little bit of flight time from the motors not being as efficient, but you've got a half a gram weight benefit with the Newb Drone frame, and if you're using the steel screws, the screws on this frame are a lot shorter, and so you save another 0.15 or so grams from the shorter screws as compared to the Meteor 65 frame. So what you're looking at is more than just the 3.3 versus 2.8 or 2.9 gram. I think, yeah, 2.9 grams, so 0.4. It's more like a 0.5 to 0.6 difference in weight. When I flew the quad in this frame, it did feel lively. It did also feel maybe a little slippy. I don't know. I don't have enough time on it to really conclude that. I've got to look at the logs for the tracking as well. But I would say that this frame is viable from my first impressions. And so, I think we can start to look at where's the benefit, where's the trade-off between a slightly cleaner, lower resonance frame versus dropping, over a half gram of weight. That is real weight. But I need to fly more and see if this has any other characteristics I don't like. I'm very used to flying the Meteor 65 frame, and so familiar with it. But the Newb Drone frame is a little bit new to me, so I gotta kind of spend some time with it and see what I think. What was interesting was I didn't really see much difference in the logs between the old frame and the new frame. If anything, the new frame logged worse, but that was, I think, because one of my motors started just rattling more, which is always a little bit tricky. So I do need to kind of go back and maybe compare these 3 frames a little bit more in terms of the Newb Drone, their lightweight frame, I forget what they call it, versus the Meteor 65, new and old. And when I'm saying new and old with the Meteor 65, I'm just talking about how long I've had it, not that Beta FPV redesigned the Meteor 65 frame. All right, let's jump over the logs and I'll show you what those look like, at least the preliminary ones. All right, let's dive into the logs here. So I've got these logs pulled up in Betaflight Blackbox Explorer. So I've got the my older Meteor 65, this frame that I've flown a lot. Got a log from that one. Then we go into the Newb Drone durable frame. After that one, I've got the Newb Drone light frame. Then the Happy model. And then last, I've got another of the Newb Drone, Meteor 65 frames, and this one's new, brand new out of the box. And on these, I have the slider just pushed all the way up. We're looking at the gyro scaled on the roll axis first, and I just have the gyro pulled, or this slider pulled all the way up to kind of highlight these differences to make it easier to see for video purposes. So this is pretty typical of what you see on these frames. And if you look at so this is just the frequency of the noise, or the amplitude at any frequency. And if you plot frequency versus throttle, what you see is that you have a mix. You got the motor band in here, plus you got these heavy frame resonances. So the motor band is going this way, where it changes with the throttle, versus the frame resonances are these kind of straight up and down peaks. And one of the things that is sort of interesting to me is that the location of this has sort of moved for whatever reason since I did the filtering on this frame. And my static notch that I put on here is actually probably lower than it needs to be. I could probably move it up a little bit. seeing this black box again, which is kind of like reinforces my sort of paranoia about flying any quad without black box on, especially these little whoops, because unless you look at the black box of your personal build, you really don't know what your noise is going to look like, and I don't think you can really optimize the filtering without looking at your actual noise. But anyways, with that little digression, I digress? Yeah, digression aside, let's see what we see. So if meter 65 is sort of the benchmark, and I'm just using it as a benchmark because I think it's a pretty decent frame. If we look at the Newb Drone durable frame, we're paying a weight penalty here of, let's say, 1.7 grams. And we really didn't get anything back in terms of cleaner noise. In fact, it's a whole lot worse. In fact, this is the only frame that I'm seeing what I kind of call this like volcano sign, where it really just sort of loses control. Now, obviously, if we bring the slider back to kind of a more typical area, it's not going to look as horrible, but comparing all of these with the slider at the same position, we see that that looks like a mess. We'll also look at the traces themselves and kind of see what that looks like, but I want to start with this overview first. Then next one we have is the Newb Drone light frame. So if anything, this should have been the problem child based on weight. And you can see that I think overall there's more noise here than the meter 65 frame. The meter 65 is a little cleaner here, but it's not necessarily more noise down low, it's more noise up high, where theoretically you can kind of start to filter this a little bit better. So it's a little bit less problematic having noise up here versus if it was down in this area. And it's just the amount of noise here, if it is more, is not nearly as egregious as the durable frame. So if you are a Newb Drone fan and you want to fly a Newb Drone frame, I'm having a hard time, other than maybe some durability thing, where I'm having a hard time seeing why you would not pick the Newb Drone light frame, which has a better noise profile, versus the durable frame. The Happy Model frame, I think this one actually looked pretty decent. There's some interesting things going on here, though. If we look at this really low stuff down here. So this is meter 65. The Happy Model, I don't know, could be just bad luck, could be my flying, could be something different, but there's just a little bit more of this low-end kind of noise down here. Maybe this is the loose battery causing that, but there is just more junk down here, even though the rest of the noise profile doesn't look too bad. So Happy Model is sort of like a little bit good news and bad news, but just from the battery issue alone, I'm not flying this frame. I don't think it's worthwhile, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. If we compare it down low between the light frame and the meter 65, it's fairly similar. Maybe a little bit better on the meter 65 than the Newb Drone frame, but in either case, I don't think the Newb Drone light frame is terrible down here. Really, the only frame that really got my attention noise-wise that made me really concerned is really this Newb Drone durable frame, and that's kind of the main story there. But let's look at the pitch. So you can't just look at one axis, so let's look at the other axis and see if the story changes dramatically, and it sometimes does. So we swap all these over to pitch. All right, now we're on pitch. You can see that the meter 65 frame on pitch does a lot better than it does on roll. And I think that's mainly because it's utilizing the battery well to kind of stiffen up and brace the frame. And when we look at the Newb Drone durable frame, it actually does better on pitch, but not as good as the meter 65 frame. And then if we look at the light frame, again, I think it's doing a little bit better on pitch, but not as good as the meter 65. And we look on the Happy Model frame, and again, I think this is because the battery's not sitting in there tight enough, but it still looks pretty like has this kind of broad-based low frequency stuff on pitch that doesn't seem to be as clean down low as the others. And then the last one, this one was kind of a little bit surprising me. Just this is the new frame of the meter 65 I had, and it just seemed a little bit noisier down here, down low, as compared to that. Maybe not a huge difference, but I thought just a little bit more of a difference there. It's important to look at the traces though to see where this noise is coming from. Now I have Expo on because I really want to bring this out. But let's scrub through some of these traces and see what we see here. So now we're going to see both the gyro scaled roll and pitch at the same time. The roll is in red and the pitch is in blue. And let's go ahead and get the meter 65 frame going. And I'm just going to start over here, kind of from the beginning, and we'll actually play it. I got the speed down at 50%. And so what you're just looking for here is just generally how noisy are these traces? Like how much of this, wiggly stuff do you see going up and down? Is it consistent? Does it flare up at certain points in time? Or is it, like what's the pattern you see? And it's good to kind of scrub across these just in general to kind of get a good sense of where that noise is accumulating from and see if you have any problem spots. So that's the meter 65. So kind of keep that in mind for yourself. Now we will jump over to the Newb Drone durable frame. And let's get this one playing back. And to me, as we look at this one in general compared to the meter 65, it's just, you can see why that graph accumulates the higher values because there is just more noise here, particularly on the roll. The roll seems more dramatic generally. We'll pick a couple spots to kind of scrub through, and you can see just, it just gets noisy. So that's what the Newb Drone durable frame looks like. Now we'll go to the Newb Drone light frame. Whoa, speed, slow down. Okay, so there's Newb Drone light, and if I'm just looking at the traces, I think I'd have a pretty hard time saying that this is definitely worse than the meter 65. It's not as dramatic of a difference as versus the durable frame. And we'll do the happy model frame here. And so this happy model frame, I think looks, again, oftentimes, pretty clean, but then it's kind of has these flares of noise. But I'd have a hard time just looking at that and saying it's dramatically different than the meter 65 frame. All right, so, big picture wise, I think the real take home from this is that we've got one frame really in terms of the Newb Drone durable frame that really just doesn't perform, especially at that weight, it just really doesn't perform at all compared to these others. And, just based on sort of my criteria, which is I want a frame I can just use and not have to wedge in the battery and things like that. I think that both this Newb Drone light frame and the meter 65 frame are worth kind of like a closer look. So we'll keep digging in on that and then go ahead and take a look at some other stuff. So the next thing we're going to look at, and I'm going to leave this for another video, but we'll go ahead and look at how this is tracking set point. So take me a second to find it here. Let's say set point roll, and then we'll get gyro roll. So the clean gyro roll. Get rid of these. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at how is this, and let's take off the expo here. What we'll do is we'll take a look and see how is this tracking. When we do our little, I got rid of expo, there we go. When we do our snap rolls and snap flips, and when we do our little twitch moves and things like that, we'll see if we can spot any differences between the frames that way. But I think for this video, I'm going to call this one here. Until next time, cheers.